Anne Distel is the Senior Curator Emerita of the French National Museums. Her career started in 1969 at the former Museum de Jeux de Paume in Paris, and then from 1980 to 2003, she was at the Musée d'Orsay, and from 2003 to 2008, Chief of Collections at the Direction des Musées de France. As a specialist in Impressionist painting, Anne contributed to the organization and accompanying catalogs of many international exhibitions, notably the Centenaire de l'Impressionnisme, or Impressionism, a Centenary, in 1974, that was shown at the Metropolitan Museum of Art here in New York, Pissarro in 1980, and Renoir in 1985. Both of those exhibitions were organized together with the Art Council of Great Britain and the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, and Seurat in 1991 that also showed at the Met. From Cézanne to Matisse, great paintings from the Barnes collection opened in Washington in 1993. Gustave Caillebotte in 1994 had a venue at the Art Institute of Chicago. And then once again at the Met, Une amie de Cézanne et Van Gogh, Le Docteur Gachet in 1999, and Paul Signac in 2001. In addition to all of these exhibitions and catalogs, Anne has written independent publications and articles on collectors of Impressionism, including her book, Impressionism, The First Collectors, that was published in 1990. Her most recent monograph on Renoir was translated and published in English in 2009. This afternoon, Anne will speak to us about the early and very courageous collectors of Impressionism in her paper titled, This Kind of Painting Sells, Collectors of Impressionist Painting, 1874 to 1914. Please give a warm welcome to Anne Distel.
Thank you, Inge, and thank you, Rick, for inviting me to talk again about Impressionist collectors. Rick was warning about lists, and I'm afraid that I will be reading a list tonight, but I hope that a few pictures will come as well and will enliven this directory of early collectors. In 1878, Théodore Duret published one of the first essays dedicated to the Impressionist movement, Les Peintres Impressionnistes. Duret was a critic of contemporary painting and a collector in his own right, in touch with most of these painters. He immediately saw the importance and the originality of the few amateurs who supported the emerging artists. The public, and I quote him, the public who is laughing so much when looking at the paintings of the Impressionists must be even more surprised this kind of painting sells. He suggested a list of 10 names, which you might see on the screen. Many of these names, but not all, had already been quoted in the Impressionist exhibition catalogues printed in 1874, 76, and 77. And it's still relevant today. Théodore Duret himself, a writer, a political activist, a Republican, living on the income of a brandy business in Cognac, friend of Zola, Courbet, Manet, and Whistler. You see his portrait here by Whistler, and all the Impressionists, including Cézanne. Among his friends were Albert and Henry Escht, the Escht brother, here in the Degas painting, were merchants dealing in exotic woods and products, opera-goers who knew Manet and Degas. Degas himself was among the foremost collectors of his time, but we shall not dwell on him, and his collection is well known. However, we must mention that he is not named by Duret, Degas' best friend, Henri Rouard, an engineer, but also a painter who exhibited with the Impressionists, which is the reason why Duret did not mention him. So you have his portrait by Degas, and one of his most celebrated pictures, which finally went to the Metropolitan Museum. There was also an opera singer, a real star of his times, Jean-Baptiste Faure, here represented by Manet, and again, a more day-to-day portrait also in the Metropolitan Museum. Of course, he was one of the owners of the famous Déjeuner sur l'Herbe, and he almost owned all the important paintings by Manet, such as this one. Then comes the heir to a textile company, ruined by his passion for collecting, who became an art critic, Ernest Hochdé, here represented with his daughter by Manet, and with the eponymous painting Impression Soleil Levant, which he lost to another collector after his bankruptcy, the Romanian aristocrat practicing homeopathy, Georges de Belliot. Georges de Belliot, who was also a very important collector of Monet, and a collector of Berthe Morisot also, a picture in Washington, and the collection went to the Musée Marmottan through his daughter. And also another picture who once belonged to Georges de Belliot, but not maintained in the collection, and that's why he came also to the Washington National Gallery. There was also a low-level finance ministry administrator, Victor Choquet, here painted by Renoir with one of his prize Delacroix, and by Cézanne, whose paintings he owned and was the first and most important supporter all his life. And this is also a Choquet painting now in Moscow. Again, another Choquet painting, but this one closer to us in the Metropolitan Museum. The next would be the Flaubert and Zola publisher, Georges Charpentier, and his wife, here represented by Renoir in their Hôtel Particulier in Paris, where Madame Charpentier had a salon. Of course, I won't dwell very much on this painting, which is one of Renoir's masterpieces. And the next name I would quote is the one of Jean Dollfus, a businessman, and I will show rather the portrait of Monet by Renoir that he bought and which went to the Musée d'Orsay, well, to the French National Collection and then the Musée d'Orsay. Several other rich men with a taste for the arts, Charles Dedon, the original owner of La Prune, Charles Efrussi, the famous anecdote where when he bought the bunch of asparagus, paid the requested price, Manet sent him another one saying there was one missing to your bunch. And Paul Bérard, who was one of the most active supporters of Renoir, one of the important and definitive paintings of middle career of Renoir. And Léon Clapisson, the son of a well-known musician, and here are the three portraits of Madame Clapisson that you already saw a while ago. This Forfour, this failure that Renoir regretted, and nevertheless Clapisson had a very nice collection besides the portrait of his wife. We should also name the Comte d'Oria, an aristocratic landowner, and his friend Nicolas Hazard, but Doria was one of the first owners, the first owner of the Cézanne. And finally, Dr. Paul Gachet, never forgotten because of the portraits painted by Van Gogh, and his friend, the pastry cook, poet, and very forgettable painter, Eugène Murer. Again, another important man in himself, the musician Emmanuel Chabrier, here painted by Manet, and of course the owner of one of the most beautiful Manet's painting. Again, from the list of Duret, Ernest May, a banker in this famous Orsay à la Bourse. And the collectors I just mentioned were French, mainly Parisian, as the artists themselves who were exhibiting in the French capital. But it must be remembered that Impressionism was exported abroad early on as a result of Paul Durand-Ruel's activity. As I must be brief, and as many of these aspects will be addressed later, I will only speak about the French amateurs. Most of these collectors were wealthy, but they were not very rich, and some were even rather of modest means. As Duret said, the painting sold, but not so well, and a few francs at this time could buy you a painting. Duret stressed that in a letter of encouragement to Pissarro in 1874. He wrote, "You have succeeded in reaching a limited public composed of tasteful connoisseurs who are not big players paying high prices. In this small world, you will find buyers willing to pay 200, 400, 600 francs. You must expect to wait for many years before you can sell for 1,500, 2,000 francs. Everything will eventually come to you, even glory and wealth. In the meantime, your friends' and amateurs' appreciation will make up for the fool's neglect." Although the amounts spent on buying art by themselves were not important in relation to the cost of living, they nevertheless implied the existence of a disposable income. These special amateurs evoked by Duret were buying art by living artists, but many of them were also interested in older masters or artists from the École de 1830, Barbizon School, Millet, Corot, Delacroix, Daumier. They started to collect paintings by Manet and the Impressionists, sometimes because they were afraid of buying fakes. They realized also that buying young and still unrecognized artists cheap could later offer a nice financial premium. Indeed, they could observe how the École de 1830, Rousseau, Daubigny, etc., the Barbizon painter, and even Corot, after being cheap for years, were commanding high prices. And they were also happy to distinguish themselves with a tinge of dandyism in their attitude. They were married, mostly male or single. Many were Republicans, that is progressive, but some more conservative. Durand-Ruel, for example, the dealer was a royalist. There were Catholics, Protestants, Jews, Freemasons, or agnostics. But there were such a small number that it is difficult to generalize about them, but each forms a piece of a large puzzle. One collector deserves special attention, Gustave Caillebotte. Though he bought many pictures exhibited in the Impressionist exhibition, he was not clearly identified as a lender, only by his initials. Wishing to appear as an artist, Duret did not name him, as in the case of Rouard. But at age 28, he had already written his will in November 1876, bequeathing his collection of Impressionist or Intransigence painters to the French state, naming Pierre-Auguste Renoir as his executor. We shall comment more thoroughly on the importance of his decision later. So here is Caillebotte, self-portrait with the Moulin de la Galette in the background, and one Manet, Monet, Cézanne, bequest to the French National Museum. After 1890, the first group of collectors we just evoked, who had started to acquire paintings in the early 1870s, did not buy anymore. A few of their collections were even sold after the death or voluntarily, of the death of their owner or voluntarily. Ernest May in 1890, Clapisson in 94, Chabrier in 1896 after his death, Condoria 1899, Victor Choquet 1899, the last three after their death. But Henri Rouard still had visitors in his Hôtel Particulier, Rue de Lisbonne, until his death in 1912. The financial success of his posthumous sales symbolized also the general recognition of the artist he collected. Marcel Proust, admitted as a young writer in the Charpentier residence, would remember the admirable portraits of Madame Charpentier et ses enfants by Renoir, first success of the artist at the Salon in 1879. The picture sold at auction came to the Metropolitan Museum in 1907, but Proust would remember it later in La Recherche, as well as the Monet they owned, combined in the art of the fictitious Elstir. Dr. Paul Gachet, who knew Cézanne, Monet, Renoir, Pissarro, and Guillaumin since their early career, was eager to show their paintings to visitors until his death in 1909, who discovered his Van Gogh as well. Around 1890, the Impressionists in their 50s had reached the peak of their career. Their dealer, Paul Durand-Ruel, was still in business with the help of his sons. Other dealers, Georges Petit, for example, have also helped Monet, Degas, Renoir, Pissarro, and Sisley gain, in various degrees, the financial independence they needed to pursue their aims. Newer dealers, the Bernheim Jeune Family or Vollard, were very active in gaining even more clients to what still remained an avant-garde. Official recognition and the appreciation of a larger public was still evading the group. Nevertheless, the perception that Impressionism was a legitimate art movement was making its way in larger circles as their works were finally displayed in the French National Museum of Contemporary Art, the Musée du Luxembourg in Paris. In 1890, Manet's Olympia, now in the Musée d'Orsay, was acquired thanks to a subscription instigated by Claude Monet. The contributors list, if we exclude the artists themselves, is roughly identical with Duret's list: Caillebotte, Ruard, de Belliot, Chabrier, Clapisson, the brother Echt, Duret. But there were some new names: Étienne Moronnet-Laton, Octave Mirbeau, Paul Gallimard, Maurice Leclanché, or the Princess de Polignac, née Vinaretta Singer, about whom we shall speak later. Monet's strong initiative was successful, but the violence of the opponents proves that Manet's painting was still controversial. Soon after, in 1892, a recent composition by Renoir, Jeune fille au piano, was bought by the French state after the intervention of Mallarmé. But it is the Caillebotte bequest in 1894 that allowed the Musée du Luxembourg to present decently and without paying a high price, as the museum curator, Léonce Bénédite, shrewdly pointed out to win the acceptance of his colleagues, the Impressionist movement to the public. I shall not tell again the story of the Caillebotte bequest, but 37 out of 60 works by Manet, you saw the Balcon, Le Déjeuner, Gare Saint-Lazare, Bal du Moulin la Galette, and Balançoire by Renoir, Pissarro, Sisley, Cézanne, and pastels by Degas. Monet recommended to include Cézanne works, but only 2 landscapes were accepted, and it failed to impose the masterpiece now in the Barnes collection, the Baigneur, which is now on the screen. I would like also to evoke a significant episode relating in 1899 to a late painting by Sisley. Monet again, after Sisley's death, who left 2 still young children, organized a benefit auction for them. As for Manet's Olympia, he also raised money through a subscription to buy a painting by the artist and offer it to the Musée du Luxembourg. Bénédite, still cautious after the Caillebotte bequest, accepted the painting, which was shown, but did not officially submit it to the administration. And so, Canal du Loing, 1892, was only officially accessed in the collection in the 1970s. But Gustave Caillebotte's initiative became an inspiration for several amateurs who decided to build collections that should someday be given to the state. Among these, Étienne Morenet-Laton, Isaac de Camondo, and Antonin Personnaz. Étienne Morenet-Laton, here is his apartment in Paris, was wealthy. He was the son and the grandson of collectors of Corot and Delacroix. His mother was a distinguished ceramist. After serious classical studies, he chose to be a painter and a ceramist, as well as an art historian and a collector. He was an ardent Catholic. He donated his collection to the French state in 1906. It was exhibited in 1907 in the Musée des Arts Décoratifs and transferred to the Louvre only in 1934. If one wants to summarize this collection, one may say that it starts with Corot and Delacroix, but that alongside his purchase of Manet Déjeuner sur l'herbe at Durand-Ruel in 1900, it illustrates the history of Impressionism through a few chosen artists, excluding the neo-impressionist, Gauguin, with the exception of an album Ancien Culte Maori, Van Gogh, etc. Isaac de Camondo, and again a view of his salon, wrote his will donating his collection to the Louvre with money to install it properly in 1908. He died in 1911, but the collection was not visible before 1914. Heir to a dynasty of bankers in Constantinople, his father, who settled in Paris under the Second Empire, was already an art collector. Camondo was a prominent member of the wealthy Jewish Parisian society. He was a composer. It's a music salon, as you see. He collected furniture and porcelain from the 18th century, Japanese prints, and decorative arts, but as of 1893, also acquired works by Degas and all the Impressionists, buying from Durand-Ruel, Bernheim-Jeune, and Vollard, as the amateur of his generation had less personal relationship with the artist. Thanks to Camondo, Cézanne, La Maison du Pendu, acquired at the showcase sale, and Van Gogh, Les Fritillaires, were exhibited in the Louvre before 1914. The collection is now the Musée d'Orsay. Antonin Personnaz built his collection at the same time, but it only entered the public collection after his death in 1937. Part of it was donated to the Musée Bonnat in Bayonne, Personnaz's hometown, and it is an example of the generosity of amateurs in the French province. Henri Vanier, Champagne man in Reims, François Depot in Rouen, despite sales in the early 20th century, various members of the Cercle de l'Art Moderne in Le Havre. In Paris, and so this is De Pau painting now in Chicago, and Boston, and Auguste Pellerin by Matisse. In Paris also, one may add to the list of these benefactors, Auguste Pellerin, sometimes described as the king of margarine. He first bought many Manets from Durand-Ruel, sold them to buy and form, at the turn of the century, the most extensive collection of Cézanne. He also bought works by Picasso, and his portrait by Matisse is, as you see in the Centre Georges Pompidou. But all collectors were not museum benefactors, and again a list. Maurice Leclanché was producing a type of battery invented by his brother, but belonged to a family of collectors. He had already several Monet, Renoir, and Pissarro. This is one in the Metropolitan Museum. And his collection were auctioned after his second wife's death in 1924, but he had sold many paintings before. Abbé Paul Gauguin, a client of Durand-Ruel, a patron of Renoir, who also bought a Cézanne at the Durée-Sel, was one of my favorites. His collection, for a priest, you might be surprised to find such subjects. His collection was auctioned in 1901. The critic and novelist, and this is also a Gauguin, Abbé Gauguin painting now in Orsay. The critic and novelist of Octave Mirbeau, who wrote in praise of Monet, Renoir, or Pissarro, was among the first amateurs of Van Gogh. And here is the famous iris. Denis Cochin, a politician, was a Vollard client, and he appreciated the nabis, especially Maurice Denis, but was also the first owner of these card players. Gallimard, a friend of Renoir and owner of the Théâtre des Variétés. Here is in a little sketch when he made a trip to Spain with Renoir. Henri Weber, a jeweler, and this is one of the Renoir he owned, but he very early sold his collection of French painting to buy Japanese and Middle Eastern art. Maurice Gagna, who is linked to Renoir. Olivier Sincère, also a politician, linked to the Président Raymond Poincaré. I have no image. Well, this is a Sincère painting in the Metropolitan Museum. And Georges Viau is, as a professional dentist, painted by Vuillard. He had a vast collection of Impressionists and nabis. Jacques Doucet, couturier, belonged to the same generation, but even if he knew Degas early in the 1880s, he went on to build a celebrated collection of French 18th century art that he sold in June 1912 and is now remembered as the former owner of Van Gogh irises that you saw recent, well, just a few images ago, and Picasso's The Modèle d'Avignon. An amateur also of Matisse, of the Surrealists, Picabia, Duchamp, Miro as well, and the founder of the library in Paris bearing his name. And I was struck by the fact that it resembles some pictures of Mrs. Palmer we saw recently. So it's exactly the same epoch, and it shows that they have the same taste. And so among the 18th century portraits, I have to point out, which I don't know how that works. On the easel, it is a Sisley. So the mixture is a little odd. Still younger, born in the 1860s, we may quote Georges Fado, the most famous playwright of his time, and Carolus Duran, son-in-law, was mostly known through his sales, was always short of money, but he was an avid collector of Boudin, Monet, Sisley, Renoir, and Cézanne, and his sales were in 1901, 1902, and 1903. Edouard Béran, an American in Paris, was a painter and a friend of Signac, and his collection from Monet to Seurat had also this extraordinary Degas. Gustave Fayet, principally interested in Gauguin and Redon, and again another interior. And Vinaretta Singer, Princess de Polignac, an artist, also a benefactor of the French Museum, and the Dindon by Monet in the Musée d'Orsay come from her. Another playwright, Henri Bernstein, whose portrait as a boy was painted by Manet on the left, later assembled, with the help of the Bernheim, a fine collection auctioned in 1911. And his portrait by Renoir is on the right, and it was very much in the news as his decoration by Vuillard went on sale with the Rockefeller collection the last days. The youngest, but also one of the more ambitious and tempted by speculation, he entered a partnership with the Bernheims, is Alexandre Berthier, Prince de Wagram, whose vast collection, bought from all the major dealers of the time, followed the usual system from Courbet to Cézanne, Van Gogh and Gauguin, with an interest for Denis, and this is a decoration he commissioned for his Hôtel Particulier, and Vuillard. But the taste of his family shows the discrepancy of contemporary taste. And here is something which, it's a very bad reproduction, it was auctioned recently in Paris, but those are by Flamand, the portraits of his mother and sisters. So you see that in a family, the currents and the taste might be very different. I really apologize for this avalanche of names. And, well, I apologize first for the Flamand, and I show you some better pictures which belonged to Prince de Wagram. But I wanted to suggest mainly that the amateurs of the new wave from the most diverse milieux tended to be richer than the first generation as the prices of the painting increased until 1914. Also, according to their individual taste, they came to embrace slowly new generation of artists, their contemporaries. It's an obvious trend, as you see with the Chicago collectors, found also with Leo and Gertrude Stein. In spite of the activity and proselytism of those collectors, as well as some critics and the dealers we already mentioned, official circles and the French National Museum remained cautious. A painting by Toulouse-Lautrec, Monsieur de la Porte au Jardin de Paris, presented in 1905 to the museum by the newly formed Société des Amis du Luxembourg, among which we find the usual suspects, Duret, Camondo, Pellerin, Personnaz, Sincère, Leclanché, and Blot, was rejected and is now in the Ny Carlsberg Glyptothek in Copenhagen. The modest gift by bequest of the ceramist Auguste Chaplet in 1910 of a still life by Gauguin was accepted, but none of the major paintings by the artist exhibited in Paris after his death in 1903 or 1906 was acquired. Remember, D'où venons-nous, que sommes-nous, où allons-nous belonged then to Gabriel Friseau in Bordeaux. By contrast, the Museum of Lyon dared to acquire in 1912 at the Rue Arcel, Nave Nave Mahana, for the same price as the Delacroix bought by the Louvre. No doubt that in paying 300,000 francs in 1918 for Degas' Portrait de Famille, Famille Bellelli, or 200,000 francs in 1921 for Monet, Femmes au Jardin, both early paintings by the artist, the French state tried to amend its past oversights, but it was certainly very late. Thank you.